Emily, what's on your radar?
All right, well, we face so many problems as a country, problems the political establishment, both left and right, has little interest in solving. They're doing just fine. So yes, it seems irritating that we've been thrust back into a conversation about abortion, about an America without Roe v. Wade, when the immediate material interests of so many people are at stake thanks to an ignorant and self-interested political class. But whether you're on the left or the right, you'll also believe people's material interests are at stake in the fight over Roe. Now, I know that we're an endangered species, but I remain a social conservative, and on this, I'm very much out of step with the mainstream. There's no pretending otherwise. While America is split pretty evenly between people who call themselves pro-life and pro-choice, most oppose overturning Roe when they're asked by pollsters. What is interesting, however, is that the knowledge of Roe is lower than public support for it. So in a 2019 survey, Indiana University researchers found 65.7% of the sample incorrectly answered that abortion would be illegal everywhere if Roe v. Wade were overturned. Fewer people still realize that Ruth Bader Ginsburg and a host of liberal scholars, actually many of them, who support abortion, criticized the Roe decision on legal grounds for years and years and years. Ginsburg said it, quote, ventured too far in the change it ordered and presented an incomplete justification for its action. So when Justice Alito's draft majority opinion in the Dobbs case leaked this week, it felt shocking to a lot of people. But the foundation for nationwide legalized abortion has always been fragile. The media just wasn't telling us that. And this is where the media's class blind spot comes in. Support for abortion increases with education and income. People in lower income brackets are much less supportive of abortion than wealthier people. It is absolutely correct, as the New York Times wrote in 2019, that women getting abortions today are far more likely to be poor than those who had the procedure done 20 years ago. Without Roe, there's no question poorer women will disproportionately be in danger from illegal procedures, no question at all. It is a travesty now, and it will be a travesty then, and it will happen. The public is very split on the morality of abortion. Gallup data from 2021 found that respondents asked whether abortion was morally wrong, morally acceptable, or depending on the situation, were more supportive as yearly household income increased. This tracks well with education level too. Above the $100,000 a year income threshold, 63% of people said abortion was morally acceptable and 32% said morally wrong. Below the $40,000 threshold, those numbers were almost reversed. Only 38% of respondents said it was morally acceptable, while 55% said it was morally wrong. This pattern is pretty consistent among Gallup's recent research on the question. So from their wealthy, educated bubbles, journalists and the corporate class characterize opposition to abortion as an extreme position held mostly among religious zealots who wear ankle skirts. However, outside those bubbles, that is simply not the case. But it's certainly what's caused Democrats like Tim Ryan, for instance, to buckle under pretty immense pressure from the increasingly wealthy and educated Democratic base, going from pro-life and to now holding positions on abortion that are outside the mainstream, as my former editor Tim Carney outlined this week. And that brings me to CNN's Kirsten Powers, a woman whose job for years has been to opine on politics day in and day out on major platforms. After the draft leaked, Powers tweeted this. All right, that is such a ridiculous argument. It could only be made by someone conditioned into absurd levels of ignorance by our legacy media. But it's a very common argument. Here's another example of it from a professional cable pundit. Even the many pro-life people I know who cite the Bible as their primary reason for their stance on abortion also fundamentally believe it's a matter of medical science. For many, many, many people, that's indeed the primary reason they oppose abortion. So arguments about the First Amendment make absolutely no sense whatsoever. If you believe medical science shows that life begins at conception, you do not believe this is a matter simply of religious freedom or bodily autonomy. And by the way, I am so opposed to the government controlling women's bodies that I support legalized prostitution. I guess that makes me an outlier even among the social conservatives. But when another life is at stake, the question is just not the same. And that's where a fundamental disconnect happens. So on this, I'm actually aligned with renowned atheist Christopher Hitchens on the fetus. Hitchens once said, quote, "It certainly couldn't be dead, since the whole battle consisted in how or whether to stop its growing and developing, not metastasizing. Now and then there would be a tussle over whether it was fully a human life, but this was casuistry. What other species of life could it be?" Hitchens also argued all the nonsense we hear about immediate animation, the point where a soul enters the unborn and so on, is at best beside the point. It has in common with the sectarian feminist view a complete contempt for science and the theory of evolution, which establishes beyond reasonable doubt that life is a continuum. So where do you draw the line in that continuum? Well, it's first important to concede we're talking about a continuum, not a light switch that gets flipped on. This is an enormous problem with the abortion discourse. The media has distorted the debate to the point where even high information people don't understand what the other side really, really believes, and is thus arguing against a straw man. Whatever you believe on abortion, that is just not at all constructive. In a somewhat famous 1995 essay, former feminist darling Naomi Wolf argued the pro-choice movement seriously harmed itself by shrinking from the reality that abortion extinguishes a human life. That confronting the reality was better for women, that it's important to actually defend a woman's right to exercise this autonomy over the life growing inside of her. Feminism, at its best, is based on what is simply true, Wolf wrote in The New Republic. While pro-lifers have not been beyond dishonesty, distortion, and the doctoring of images, many of those photographs are in fact photographs of actual DNCs. Those footprints are in fact the footprints of a 10-week-old fetus. The pro-life slogan, "Abortion stops a beating heart," is incontrovertibly true. While images of violent fetal death work magnificently for pro-lifers as political polemic, the pictures are not polemical in themselves. They are biological facts. We know this. You can call a developing baby a clump of cells. It's true, a zygote is tiny and doesn't resemble those of us on the outside walking around and eating ice cream, but its DNA absolutely does. It's the unique product of fertilization. We're all drawing the line somewhere on this continuum, whether it's at fertilization, implantation, or way further down the line, and for most people on either side, that decision is based on an interpretation of science. And so the media's abysmal coverage of abortion politics has left us so poorly equipped to confront the reality of an America without Roe, to debate it at the dinner table or at town hall meetings or even on Twitter. It's true that people on the right may not understand all of the nuances of the left's pro-choice argument, but that's the argument given the most serious representation in media and in Hollywood. And by the way, we really talk about the downstream consequences of abortion norms, like how even people, including Janet Yellen, have found it increased the number of out-of-wedlock births because it fundamentally changed the way people approached sex. That's why one of the most depressing things I saw on this very depressing week was a series of tweets from Aaron Rupar. At best, here, Rupar is saying it's somehow newsworthy for a news outlet to ask questions of the most powerful people atop a major political movement. At worst, he's saying it's wrong, which is an increasingly popular argument, as you can see from this Keith Olbermann tweet. MSNBC viewers should know what Kristen Hawkins and Marjorie Dannenfelser think, not merely because they're pro-life, but because they influence who gets nominated for president, who gets nominated to the Supreme Court, what laws state pass, and much, much more. Fox actually hosted this exchange between Geraldo Rivera and Greg Gutfeld.
When you go anywhere on social media, it's something to celebrate, to cherish, right? The unborn, to shout.
That's baloney.
No, well,
that's baloney.
I'll give you evidence.
The wire hanger stuck up their privates, trying to get what? Come on.
The unborn child.
Come on. That's
the unborn
the
child
world
becomes
before Roe.
This is exactly what I expected.
Well.
You bring out the old coat hanger.
Arrogant.
Go for it, Geraldo. Come on, keep going.
Okay, Joey.
You're making a fool of yourself.
On this.
Don't you? You know something?
What?
You insulting punk.
Okay.
Oh, what? Am I your new Bongino?
So even with a healthier, more honest media, this issue would be contentious. There's no question about that. But the media's class blind spot and intense partisan loyalty that it creates has done an enormous disservice to the public. It sanctimoniously lectures us about serving all of the time. Ryan, you probably disagreed with 99% of that, but I will ask, I think it's important to recognize that there is a class blind spot in the media when it talks about abortion. And it's interesting, when we talk, one of the things I love is the left's media criticism, whether it's Chomsky or I talked to Ari Rabenhaupt about this a couple of weeks ago on my podcast. I think a lot of it is really accurate. I'm curious what you think about media coverage of abortion, and if you also take the perspective that it's important to have the sort of the so-called mainstream media, the legacy media, engaging pro-life leaders in these conversations, having them on their air, so that we can actually have a pretty accurate depiction of where both people stand.
I mean, the mainstream media is broadly pro-choice. I think that's and actually people when I've worked in both the mainstream media and left media. and people, when right wingers say, well, isn't the mainstream media liberal? I'm like, well, yeah, they're liberal in the sense that they're like pro-choice, but like, and they're for marriage equality, but like otherwise they're not left. So whatever the media and whatever the left and whatever progressive movement, whatever they've been doing for the last 30 years, has been wrong. Like that is like we can say that now as a fact. Like they have been beaten. The fight isn't over. You're going to see, I think, a huge backlash to this over the years. It's going to come at the cost of women's lives. I hope it's a minimal number of it before the backlash forms. But clearly, what they've been doing hasn't worked. Now, I think you're also going to see, and I'm curious for your take on this, extraordinary right-wing overreach on this. Like I think the idea that people like Alito are content to say, you know what, this is a deeply moral question about the murder of an unborn child, but we're going to leave it up to the states. Like that's completely incoherent. Like if you believe that that's the case, you wouldn't allow New York and California to go ahead with that. He must only be doing that because he feels like that's politically, what he can get away with at the time. We were talking earlier in the show about Louisiana. I pulled up this legislation that they're pushing now. They define person as includes a human being from the moment of fertilization and also includes a body of persons. Unborn child means an individual being from fertilization until birth. And so what that would essentially do is say that a fertilized egg is life, and therefore anything that ends that is murder, and therefore birth control, IUD, IVF, most forms of birth control would then be criminalized. Do you feel like that's where this is headed?
Yeah, I actually think it's a great question because it's going to be fascinating to watch the pro-life movement sort of make those decisions as they influence state laws around the country going forward. And it is, that's why when we had Mallory on earlier, I was really interested in her segment with Terry Moran because I think Moran's question is fair. I mean, I think he pushed it in a way that revealed some bias, but the question is fair. And I think pro-life people have always been split between what's known in the movement as incrementalism and full abolition. And so that debate now is going to be pushed to the front and center. I think the existence of Roe really papered over some of those deep questions on actually both the pro-choice movement and in the pro-life movement. And so going forward, I think politically, you are absolutely going to see Republican overreach, 100%. There's just no question about it. That is going to happen, and it's not going to be good for Republicans politically. Now, in some cases, I may think that it's principled, and I haven't actually looked at the Louisiana law yet, so I don't know. But in some cases, I may say, by all means, overreach because people's lives are at stake. And I think Alito was basically saying, he was not talking about this broad. He was talking about Roe in particular. This is a case that was testing Roe, which is why he kicked it back to the states because he said Roe just was an overreach in and of itself, a federal overreach in and of itself. But that question is a really, really good one. And again, to go back to Terry Moran, he was pushing Mallory to say, if you fundamentally believe that at every stage of life after conception in the womb, taking that life is murder, is taking a life, then explain to me why you don't treat mothers who are complicit in it in that way, and is pushing to get the pro-life movement to say, yes, that is what we believe. And so how the pro-life movement handles that question tactically and principally is, I have no idea yet. But I think, Mallory's answer to Terry Moran was pretty revealing when she said, we don't believe in punishments for the mother. There may be some people in the pro-life movement who do, but the sort of mainstream pro-life movement has that answer prepared.
And my understanding of this movement the entire time has been that it was kind of a combination of true believer foot soldiers, and then also leaders who were kind of cynically weaponizing those true believers to create this marriage of the kind of Falwell religious right and the Chamber of Commerce to like
Fusionism.
mash together this coalition, right? And the Chamber of Commerce types always believed that they were going to dangle this. They were going to use the fact that Roe existed as a way to get people out to the polls, and then they were going to funnel them in to this kind of family values, patriarchal kind of politics that would then blend nicely with deregulation, neoliberalism, cutting taxes, and that would be the plan, but that they wouldn't actually go and do that. So were there more true believers than the kind of cynical leaders of this expected there to be, or did the politics of it kind of just drive them there, that they, whether they believed it or not, they, in order to win primaries, they had to go more and more extreme until you're like, oh, we're actually going to overturn Roe v. Wade?
Yeah, I do think, the majority of the conservative movement is genuinely pro-life, but that fusionist sort of marriage with the Chamber of Commerce side is exactly as cynical as you just outlined, which is, infuriating. Whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, it is just cynical politics. And that's why Mitch McConnell this week was coaching, he was coaching people to say the problem, when they're asked about the leaked Alito draft, he's coaching people to talk about the fact that it was leaked and not the substance of the draft. And that's because there are establishment Republicans who have no will to defend a post-Roe America, but have happily sort of pulled the levers in campaigns and pushed and nudged people to run on opposing abortion in areas where it was politically expedient and convenient. And again, that is as cynical and as disgusting politics as it sounds.
And this is going to create so many healthcare complications for women who aren't actually trying to get abortions, but are just trying to get healthcare, and it turns out that their pregnancy is running into some difficulties, and they're going to find so many states and so many hospitals where they can't get what could be life-saving treatments. So how is that something that has been how does the religious right think about that? How's the movement think about it? Is that something, well, we'll deal with that in a post-Roe world, or because forget the tragedies, these women are going to die even setting
agree.
that aside, it's awfully politically damaging too if the laws are causing the deaths of women whose parents then are going to spend the rest of their lives reminding everybody what these laws did to their grown children, or in many cases their children, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls.
Yeah, no, I agree on both points. I think that's absolutely going to happen. I don't think it's going to be politically convenient for a lot of Republicans to have to answer those questions. And my response as somebody who is pro-life would be, if you are principled, you are pro-life, you defend it, you be honest about your position and defend it. And that's a different question than trying to be mealy-mouthed and work around it and have these nonsense sort of excuses. And I don't expect that to happen, honestly. And so I think that's not a good development. And I do think the pro-life movement, honestly, as shaky of a foundation as Roe always has been, I did not expect it to be overturned in my lifetime. I think the same is true of many people in the pro-life movement. And so I do hope you're right, Ryan, that I do hope that people's attention in the movement shifts to making this as safe as possible, because there's no way around the fact that women are going to get hurt in a post-Roe America, because abortion has existed for thousands of years. People have always been trying to induce abortions. It is going to happen. It is going to be more dangerous in a world where it's not legal in all of our states. And so I do hope that the pro-life movement moves in that direction and finds a way to make this new country, if the opinion is what's handed down, ultimately as safe as it possibly can be for women.
Right, yeah, because there's two sides. There's the ectopic pregnancy side, where people who many of them got, it was a planned pregnancy, but it went badly, and the fetus remains alive in the tube, and if you don't remove it and instead wait for it to die, then you have hours before the woman dies as well. And if you can't do anything, she dies. And then you have the side of people who are going to then seek unsafe, back alley style abortions. Which we know how that ends for so many people too. But thank you for your radar. We will have more right after this.